All right, second half of Mark's Gospel. This is lay of the land here a little bit. There's three parts. The part we're in right now I'm calling the character of the kingdom. That will be followed by what I'm calling the crisis of the kingdom, borrowing the traditional meaning of that word crisis, which comes from the Greek word krisis, which means judgment. So this is the judgment aspect of the kingdom. It's a trial. Jesus goes to Jerusalem. By all external appearances, we think Jesus is being tried by the leaders in Jerusalem. It's just the opposite. Jesus is putting Jerusalem on trial. He goes to the temple, gathers evidence. He renders his verdict. Not one stone will be left upon another. He pronounces judgment. Your house is left to you desolate. The kingdom is taken from you and given to others worthy of it. All of this is Jesus as prophet, priest, and king, discharging his responsibilities as Messiah in Jerusalem during what we call Holy Week, coming up right now in our religious calendar, of course. It's followed then by the creation or the establishment of this kingdom. Elsewhere, Jesus says, all authority is given unto me. He ascends. The meaning of that is he ascends to his throne. That's why we confess as Christian people, Jesus is Lord, Lord of lords, King of kings, ruler of the kings of the earth. It all took place when the kingdom was given to him, and it was put in place, and we are in this kingdom, and he will reign till he's put every enemy under his feet. So this last half of Mark's Gospel now is painting the picture of the kingdom. We're in the first chunk of that last half, the character of the kingdom, and it's organized around three predictions of the Passion. The first of those, the path of suffering and glory. The second one that we come to this morning, the ethics of humility and service. That's what this kingdom is about. It's not about puffing ourselves up. It's about finding those who are in need of our service and giving it freely with no expectation of repayment because we do it as unto Christ. It's the way of serving Christ, who is to us right now not visible, but the people around us are visible, especially those in need. And so this is the character of this kingdom. And then the final prediction brings us to the last little angle on the kingdom, which I'm calling, for the time being anyway, the ideal citizen. Exemplified for us by the man known as blind Bartimaeus. You remember blind Bartimaeus, who is blind but given eyes to see, and he follows Jesus. And the details of that story really seem intended by Mark to paint a picture of what true discipleship looks like. So right now we're in the second of those, the ethics of humility, and it begins when Mark tells us, then they departed from there and passed through Galilee. He didn't want anyone to know it. The there that they departed from was the region of Caesarea Philippi. They traveled from the north back to that town that had been Jesus' headquarters for the time that he's been working here in Galilee, which is the town of Capernaum. This is the last reference to Galilee that we're going to hear of in Mark's Gospel until after the resurrection. From here, Jesus is going to head for Jerusalem. Luke tells us he set his face as a flint to go to Jerusalem, the belly of the beast, the place where it's going to be that path of suffering for sure. And yet Jesus will not be deterred from heading into that place where he will be in the center of the controversy that erupts there. You may recall last week we looked at the Transfiguration. If the Transfiguration took place at Mount Tabor, which at least has traditionally been regarded as probable, then it looks a little bit out of order, doesn't it? Jesus went down to Tabor, then back up to Capernaum. And I'm just going to tell you, I think probably Mark played with the chronology, assuming that the Transfiguration took place on this journey to Jerusalem. Mark uses a little bit of his editorial license to change the chronology, which all the New Testament gospel writers do. Matthew does it, of course, dramatically as he groups stories together under various headings and so on. We're not holding these gospel writers to some sort of chronological accuracy. It's not their purpose to do so. They're telling us a story, they have an agenda, and they tell the stories to communicate that point. So, for those who may be concerned about that, just that little footnote. But anyway, off they go. Jesus doesn't want them to know it. One commentator said this is something like graduate school now for the disciples, you see. His ministry up until this point has largely been to the masses, to the large crowds, sometimes unruly crowds. We've seen plenty of that as we've gone along. Now it seems that Mark narrows the focus, has more intense training for a smaller group, advanced lessons in humility, in mercy, in charity, the stuff of the kingdom. This section is introduced now by the second prediction of the Passion. He taught his disciples and said to them, "The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise the third day." Jesus taught this to his disciples. Mark puts this in the imperfect tense. He was teaching them as an ongoing. So I imagine many more times than the three that are mentioned here. He kept instructing them as to what awaited them in Jerusalem. So now we have two predictions. On the face of it, they look very similar. In the details, they're quite different. And Mark arranges the pronouncement of the prediction as a way of introducing the theme that's going to follow the prediction. So in the first one, we hear the Son of Man must suffer many things. He's going in, it's really the active voice, grammatically. He's going in and he's going to suffer in Jerusalem, but now we hear that he's being betrayed. It's the passive voice. And so even grammatically, a little hint of the difference. The passive voice reminds us of Isaiah 53, which is mostly in the passive voice. The suffering servant suffers willingly, like a lamb, silent, being led to the slaughter. Think about the way these statements are given to us. He was wounded, the passive voice, for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. He was oppressed. He was afflicted. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. He was taken from prison and from judgment. He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. The whole point of this is that Jesus is willingly, voluntarily passive in this process that is going to apparently victimize him, but in fact, he is in the driver's seat through the whole set of circumstances. And it all begins, it's all hinted at least to us in this statement, he was betrayed. He was betrayed into the hands of men. The Talmud has an interesting comment. If a man should tell you, I am God, he is lying. If he says, I am the Son of Man, he will regret it. It's in the Talmud. Jesus came to Jerusalem claiming to be the Son of Man, identifying himself with that role. It's almost like these guys wanted to make sure he regretted it, you see. And about everything that happens during those days of Holy Week seems calculated to make him regret it. As it turns out, they wound up looking on him whom they had pierced. They were the ones that ultimately regretted it. But at the first instance, it appeared to be the other way around. The first prediction of the Passion says he will be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. Notorious bad guys, you know. But now notice how Mark changes it. Now he's going to be betrayed into the hands of men. You know, when it's the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, it's pretty easy to blame. Those guys, a bunch of hypocrites, a bunch of duplicitous, corrupt bureaucrats. Look at the awful thing they did. It's easy to say those people did a bad thing. They railroaded this kangaroo court and had Jesus murdered. But now all of a sudden Mark wants us to see, oh, no, sorry. It wasn't just them. Who was it, you see? So the official religious leaders are sort of in the same boat with the rest of us. We're all part of that malicious mob that wanted to put Jesus to death. This is the way the New Testament wants us to understand the character of what Jesus was about when he offered his life, when he passively offered himself as a lamb. What we need to understand is what Paul teaches us in Romans chapter 5, beginning about verse 6, where Paul emphasizes that when Jesus came to save our souls, it's not because we sent him an engraved invitation. Dear Jesus, would you please come and rescue us from? We were, Paul says, hostile, we were weak, we were dead, we were helpless, we were enemies, we were against everything about him. We were, Paul says in Romans 1, God haters. There was no sense in which we had done something that was attractive in and of ourselves. This is the heart of what the New Testament calls agape love. It's the love that loves in spite of the object, not because of it. We were doing everything we could to escape from the redemptive act of God in sending his Son, but he sent him anyway. And so in some sense, we have to say that apart from grace, had we been there in the first century in Jerusalem, we would have been the ones in the crowd saying, crucify him. We would have been the ones with the hard hearts. Why is it important for us to understand that? Because it's only then that we start getting a vision, a focus, an understanding of what Christian humility is really all about. As long as we labor under the delusion that we have some kind of virtue inside us that is really something wonderful in and of itself, and that we have this without any kind of intervention of God's grace, we are deluded. We don't really quite get the hell that resides within. But when we see that we were one of those who was intent on murdering Christ in Jerusalem, then we can finally begin to appreciate just how deeply we didn't deserve the grace he gave us. And it's when we have some handle on that, and I'm going to tell you honestly, not one of us in this room, and I'm at the head of the list here, really quite appreciates it enough. How deeply we didn't deserve his grace. But if we have any sense of it at all, then we have some sense of humility. We realize that whatever our lot in life, it is so much better than we deserve. And we realize that our service to the least of these is a service which is nothing less than something that distantly resembles what Christ did for us, because we didn't deserve any of it from him. So Mark wants us to get that. He wasn't simply betrayed into the hands of religious leaders, bad guys. Well, it was bad guys, but that includes all of us. He would be killed. They will kill him. Mark strengthens the statement. Into the hands of people who would kill him, and then he will rise the third day. And both, of course, essentially corresponding in that. Interestingly, the idea of rising on the third day was a somewhat well-known notion in Jewish popular understanding. And so you bump into this resurrection on the third day idea in various places in Jewish writings of the day. For example, the Midrash on Esther chapter 5, this is a commentary on Esther chapter 5, reads, Israel is never left in dire distress for more than 3 days. The dead also will come to life after only 3 days, as it says, quoting from Hosea, on the third day he will certainly raise us up that we may live in his presence. This idea of a resurrection on the third day was there, at least to some degree, in the popular understanding of the day. Gamaliel, mentioned in the New Testament, in his commentary on Hosea chapter 6, says this, all its inhabitants shall taste the taste of death for 2 days, when there will be no soul of man or beast upon the earth, as it is said, and they that dwell therein shall die in like manner. On the third day he will renew them all and revive the dead, and he will establish it before him, as it is said, Hosea, on the third day he will raise us up, and we will live before him. So this idea of being raised on the third day was probably something that had been in the minds even of the disciples, And so when Jesus says to them, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be put to death, and rise on the third day, there was some pigeonhole in which they could put that. They'd heard that language before, but nevertheless, even though they heard it before, they didn't get it. They didn't understand, and they were, of course, afraid to ask. The word that Mark uses here, egnoun, from which we get the word ignorant. It's not used anywhere else in the New Testament except by Mark. It evidently describes this inability to correlate words about the kingdom with words about suffering and death, and they're just mystified, and Mark says they were afraid to ask. I appreciated one commentator who had quite a go on this little phrase, they were afraid to ask, saying what they were really afraid of was to press into the deepest meaning of the cross. They were afraid to go there. Maybe they had an intuition of what they would find if they did, if they pushed the issue. What do you mean, Jesus? What is this cross about? Because the cross stands, this commentary was suggesting, first of all, for our hostility and hatred of God's Son, the very thing we were saying earlier. That in some ways the malevolence toward God and His gift to us is emblemized by a cross, such an ugly, grotesque, ghastly form of execution. Bad enough when it's applied to one of us, who might have been criminals. But to take this, the most perfect human being who ever lived, who was nothing less than God walking among us, and subject Him to that abuse, becomes almost unthinkable to us that such a thing would happen. And it says to us how deep was our hatred of God, of things holy, of the righteousness that He represents, how much we wanted to escape from it. The cross stands at the same time for our complete inability to do anything about it ourselves. We couldn't have crucified ourselves to earn our salvation. It wouldn't have been bad enough, you see. Nothing we can do would finally get us there. It took this supreme act of one who was utterly not in need of salvation himself to give the perfect gift. And it says, therefore, that without that gift, we were lost. But the cross also reminds us of discipleship. Jesus says, okay, you want to be my disciple, deny yourself and take up your cross. And so the path that we now follow is a path in which the cross is sort of emblazoned upon our hearts and lives and actions. So they were afraid to ask, and maybe with good reason. Maybe they had an intuition, you see, of where that path would lead. And maybe sometimes we should be more courageous in exploring the cross. Well, that's the first little story, and then we come to the next of these, in which we have really the thesis idea of the next several stories set before us with a certain degree of kind of stark clarity in this whole debate about who is the greatest. The theme of this is humility, and we learn about it by using the disciples once again as a wonderful bad example, you know. And so here they come. They came to Capernaum, and when He was in the house, He asked them, so what were you guys arguing about on the way? But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, look, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Then He took a little child and put him among them. And taking the child in His arms, He said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. So they've come to Capernaum. They are in the house, and Jesus asks the question, so what's up? This is Jesus' last visit to Capernaum, never mentioned again in Mark's Gospel. The house they're in is presumably the house of Peter. We've talked about that earlier in Mark's Gospel. It seems most likely that that's where they resorted, the house that's referred to on more than one occasion. And so this is a place, of course, where we've on other occasions found private conversation ensuing. Jesus is there. They've all grabbed a cup of coffee. They're standing around. They've just arrived, from Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus asked the question, oh, by the way, guys, what was that you were arguing about on the road? It's a bit of an embarrassing question, I suppose. They were probably caught a little bit in the shame of being exposed in this way. I think it is interesting how honestly the disciples allow the portrait of themselves to be portrayed in the gospel. There's really no polishing up their image much, They, generally speaking, don't come off as very heroic. This would be easy to suppress. Peter, thinking of this years later, could have said to Mark, look, man, let's just kind of minimize that a little bit, that question. That was pretty embarrassing, kind of a dark moment. The disciples are just determined to make sure we see them in the wonderful, elegant honesty of who they were. I've mentioned to you the name before of one of my current heroes in the Christian faith, a man by the name of Vishal Mangalwadi. He's probably the leading Christian intellectual in India today, grew up in a Hindu background, was converted, and now lives among the poor in India, serving them, but also writing wonderful books, all of which I recommend to you heartily. But on one occasion, he said when he was early, before he'd really come to faith, he had his opportunity, while studying at Oxford, I believe, to read the Old Testament. Never really read the Hebrew Scriptures before. He thought, this will be interesting. The Jewish Scriptures, so famous. And he started reading them. He said by the time he'd read through the Old Testament, he was stunned at how anti-Semitic that book was. He couldn't believe it. He'd never seen a book produced by a people that was supposed to be celebrating their religion that treated the heroes of their religion more brutally than this book. There's no heroes in it. They all have warts. They all are notorious criminals, adulterers, disobedient people, getting off the rails constantly. He couldn't believe it. And in some ways that loosened his martyr, because he thought any religious document written by a people celebrating their religion that deals with their people dishonestly, there's got to be something to it. He'd never seen that in his Hindu, religious writings. Some of you would probably never admit it, but you may have over the years watched a Monty Python movie. Now you don't have to raise your hand, I won't call on you. But that Monty Python like to spoof ideas. And as you know, one of the spoofs they decided to do once upon a time was the life of Christ. They were going to call it the life of Brian. And as the story is told, before they decided to do the script writing, all of these folks who were involved in producing these movies and writing the script and so on, went off separately and read the gospel accounts, just to get a feel for what the source material would be. When they came back together, as the story is told by at least what appear to be reliable sources, they all agreed, we're not going to touch Jesus. Something about him just said to them, this man is off limits. And if you ever saw the life of Brian, you know that Jesus is there, but he's always in the distance, and they do just kind of leave him alone. But they said the rest of those guys are fair game. They're a bunch of they're buffoons, you see, and so they're really easy to make fun of because that's what they do already. And they had most of the script written for them right off the bat, you see, because that's the way the Scriptures are. This is an embarrassing question, and it's one of all kinds of embarrassing questions that are raised. And in some ways we feel bad for the disciples, but personally, I am so happy that that's what I find. I mean, it's such a relief to find out that, I'm an idiot, and at least to some degree they were too, and so we all kind of share this together. But besides being an embarrassing question, it was maybe more deeply a revealing question, and this may be a point where we should ask ourselves this question. What were they discussing on the journey? Well, they were discussing who would be the greatest. Who was going to sit on the right hand and on the left? Who was going to have the prestige position in the kingdom? What do we discuss as we're on our journey of faith? Francis Schaeffer famously said years and years ago that he believed Western Christianity might buckle under the weight of Christians preoccupied with what he called personal affluence, or personal peace and affluence. That the more we spend time worrying about the comforts of our life as Christians, and the less we worry about the needs of those that are surrounding us, the more we lose touch with the heart of what our Christian faith is all about. This is, of course, wasted on you, because I know you all to be saints of God that are constantly giving your lives in service to others, but nevertheless, we should ask ourselves the question, what am I worried about? Am I more worried about my plans for this weekend than I am about the kingdom of God? What really occupies my time? It was really a revealing question, I think, for anybody on this journey of faith. I'm calling this third point a contrasting question. It was a striking issue to raise when they were still in kind of earshot of having heard Jesus say, if you want to be my disciple, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And it didn't take them long to start wrestling about issues at the other end of the spectrum. Nothing here about denying oneself, you see. So all of this, packaged in this question, penetrates really to the heart of their conscience. Jim Edwards on this says, Jesus had said to them, count the costs. The disciples wanted to count the assets, of their discipleship. Well, they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. Like children caught in the act, they found their hands in the cookie jar, and they had nothing they could say. The last time Mark used this word, they were silent, was to describe the Pharisees. You may recall the story. It was back in Mark chapter 3, the healing of the man with the withered hand. And Jesus has that man stand in front of them, and then he puts a question not to the man, but to the Pharisees who were sitting off over in the corner evaluating. And the question Jesus puts to them is a rather odd question. He says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? And then to put a sharper point on it, he says, is it lawful to heal, to give life on the Sabbath, or to kill? And he looks at them, and Mark says they kept silent. Because, of course, the question was dripping with irony. Jesus was just about to heal a man, to do good. He was just about to give a man back his livelihood. He was about to give him back his life on the Sabbath. And 15 feet away, there were some people who, on the Sabbath, were plotting to destroy him, plotting to murder him on the Sabbath. And so Jesus asked the question, well, which one is preferable on the Sabbath, my friends? To give life or to take it? And they couldn't come up with a good answer, and Mark says they remained silent. And in some ways, the disciples feel the pinch here a bit themselves, because they'd been disputing in an argument that assumed kingdom glory, but not kingdom suffering. This whole question of who would be the greatest was, again, commonly debated among the rabbis. They had quite an elaborate calculus worked out as to what the seating order would be in paradise. And in fact, in some ways, they tried to replicate the intended or the expected seating order in paradise when they got together in earthly gatherings. So in the synagogue, there were the highest seats. When they got together for meals, banquets, and so on, it was very important that people were seated in these earthly settings in a way that, at least as far as we knew, anticipated the seating order that would take place in paradise. This was a debated point. And so they spent quite a bit of time wrestling with this. That probably is what was behind Jesus in the parable that he told in Luke's Gospel, chapter 14, which was inspired by one of those social occasions. Luke says he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places. saying to them, look, when you're invited by anyone to a wedding feast, don't sit in the best place. You see, your concerns are going in all the wrong directions here when you worry about that. That may be, in fact, behind Paul's comment over in Romans chapter 10, when he says, they being ignorant of God's righteousness, seeking to establish their own righteousness, their own seating order, as it will, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. The kingdom is a place for downward mobility. The kingdom is a place where we look for, try to sift out opportunities to be a servant. Not to be a lord, but to be one who is in fact giving our lives for the benefit of others. And so to make the point, he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, look, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. So Jesus sits down. This is the position of rabbinic teaching, sitting from a sitting position. We take this for granted. We've heard this whole line so many times that I think it insulates it to us. But in the first century, this was radical almost beyond any calculation. What Jesus says here is, of course, one of the most important statements and one of the best known statements from Jesus, and with good reason, because when he said it, nobody would ever have said something quite like this. He called the 12. This is not a summons. This isn't the Greek word proskaleo, which is kind of a formal summons. We've seen that earlier. This is a more gentle word. He called them, and it's a word that might have been used to describe how you would call a child. You know, if you're a grandparent and you call your little grandchild to you, so you might say, hey, come over here for a second. You know, it was that kind of warm and affectionate, kind of just come over. I want to explain something. I want to show you something. That was kind of the flavor of this summons, so it wasn't quite as weighty as the word might suggest. And so they come over, and he wants to explain to these that he's just called to himself as children, that their behavior has been a bit childish, and maybe he wants it to be a little bit more childlike. And so he explains to them, if anyone desires to be first, and notice that's not criticized. If you want to be first, that's okay. That's not what Jesus attacks here. It's good for all of us, in a sense, to want to be first. We should press toward the mark. We should have an idea. It's not so much the objective that is criticized, but the MO. How is it that we're trying to get there? You see, that's what Jesus is going to call attention to. And he says, you want to be first? Okay, that's fine. This is the way you do it. You become a servant of all. Interesting choice of words. It's the word diakonos. It's from the word from which we get the word deacon. We might have thought Jesus would use the word doulos, which would mean slave, like slave as in a property, the most demeaning status, but he doesn't use that word. He uses a word that actually has built within it at least a little bit of dignity. A diakonos was a person who served, and yet there was a kind of voluntariness about the service. It wasn't involuntary servitude, as in doulos. Diakonos, a servant. This in itself gives us a kind of transforming vision of leadership. In the ancient world, if you were a leader, then it meant you had dictatorial powers over the people that were under you. You had coercive powers. That's what it meant to be a leader. Ask Julius Caesar what it meant to be a leader. He'd never heard about servant leadership, you see. That wasn't on his radar. When it came to leading people, it meant you exercised authority over them, or as Jesus elsewhere says it, you lorded it over them. That was leadership in the ancient world. Jesus switches that up and says true leadership here, truly being first, is to voluntarily adopt what we have come to call, and I think correctly so, the servant leadership idea. That's foreign in the ancient world. Even someone as enlightened as Plato didn't go there. In the Gorgias dialogue, how can a man be happy when he has to serve someone? Good heavens, of all the things. That certainly can't be a road to happiness. Aristotle was no better in the early chapters of Politics. If you've read that, you know that he starts right off making a case that some people are born to lead and some people are born to serve. And you really are better off if you're not in that lower class. It's just inherent in our situation of birth, you see. This was really an unheard of idea that Jesus now sets before them here. In the Jewish understanding, there was at least a remote sense of it, but not very well developed. The Talmud says, "From him who seeks greatness, greatness flees, but him who flees from greatness, greatness follows." So some idea there that if you just give your life to pursuing greatness, you'll never quite get it. But even that doesn't capture what Jesus has in mind. It was at least incipient in Psalm 110, the most famous messianic psalm, most frequently quoted psalm in the New Testament. Familiar words, you've heard them. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies." And then this, "Your people shall be volunteers." Well, that's really the Hebrew word that means the idea of they will be willing. Your followers, Messiah, are not going to be those who are being extorted into following you, forced into it. They were going to be willing, because there is a kind of willingness, a kind of voluntariness about the servant leadership role that we play under the rule of King Jesus. So it's a transformation of the idea of leadership itself, which has had impressive consequences in history. You know, if you went back to the first century and looked around the civilizations of the ancient world, you would never find the office of prime minister. There was no such office. That's a Christian invention. Over the years, the idea of servant leadership, of being a leader who is a servant, began to be recognized. Maybe it was Gregory, 5th century, who first kind of formulated it. A servant of the servants of God, you see, the Pope Gregory. But eventually you begin to see in Western civilizations a political office called prime minister. What is that? Lead servant. That's a Christian invention. It's not a pagan invention. That's an idea that flows straight out of Jesus' instruction that if you want to be great, you be a servant. And we don't have a prime minister in our particular, political economy, but many places do, as you know. And that really can be traced very much to a Christian influence. Besides that, you'd have to say it really is quite an insight into human personality. I think we all know there's something unbelievably attractive about a true, genuine, sincere servant leader. I've come to memorial services in this church, celebrations of a life of a saint that's gone home to be with Christ. And that person may have been successful, they may have been a physician, or may have made a lot of money or done a lot of things, but you know what we get excited about in memorial services? Little stories about modest servant leadership. That's what gets our attention. Not somebody that built a great building somewhere and we all look at it and there's the name on the... No, it's when we hear about things that were done in the shadows, no great band playing, no great and yet it was sincere servant leadership. We just think that says it all when it comes to the quality of a life well lived. This servant leadership, based on the word diakonos, therefore, is not the notion of self-abasement. Humility is not beating myself up. Humility is not a lousy self-image. Humility is simply the practical principle of esteeming the interests of others ahead of the interests of myself and finding opportunities to serve them. And so Jesus illustrates the point by taking a little child, setting him in the midst, and taking that child in his arms, and he says to them, we don't know who this child was, but could be Peter's child. They're in the family, they're in that home possibly. The word paidion means either an infant or a small child, probably a toddler. So let's assume maybe 2 or 3 years old, something like that. You probably know that ancient society, both Jewish and Roman, did not really extol childhood all that much. That was a Christian influence in itself. Children were of less value across the board in the ancient world, especially in the pagan world, but even to some degree in the Jewish world as well. So he takes this child, took him in his arms. The word implies embrace this child in his arms. The child is here as an object lesson, but the object was not to illustrate humility. In fact, you'll look in vain for many little children that are all that humble. That's not really a childish quality. But he is there to illustrate helplessness. A little child is someone for whom you do things with no reasonable expectation of a quid pro quo in the transaction, at least not anytime soon. Children take a lot more than they give. We teach them to give, but they come into this world basically taking, and that's really what the mark of our parental servant leadership really adds up to. So Jesus is now illustrating to them the idea of serving one from whom no reasonable expectation of repayment is anticipated, and it stands generally for the rubric of doing something for the least of these, you see. And in the ancient world, the children were the least of these. So Jesus presses the point, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Receiving is not a word with extravagant expanse to it. It's the idea of a modest showing of kindness. One of these little children, in the ancient world, the child's value depended almost entirely on the adults in the child's life. That's why in the ancient world, especially in the pagan world, infanticide was absolutely common. Leaving an unwanted child out to be exposed to die in nature was practiced commonly. There was no law against anything like that. Abortion was fairly common, not safe, but common. There was a great diminution of the value of a child as opposed to the value of an adult. Service to adults was esteemed as very important. Service to children, kind of a necessary evil. One commentator was sort of playing with this anecdotally and told the story, quote, "A few years ago, through a mistake on the roll in Houston, a child 2 years old was summoned for jury duty. That was a divinely inspired mistake," the commentator remarked, "for the child is the final jury before whom our church and our civilization must stand." How do we treat children? But more than that, how do we treat the least of these, who is symbolized in a sense by the child in this case? Jesus says something astonishing. If you receive such a one, this little one, this helpless one, in my name, then you receive me. I would love to show up before Christ on Judgment Day and have him thank me for having received him. I'm going to be honest with you. I think my list of occasions I've done that is embarrassingly short. But isn't that what we would like to hear? Thank you for receiving me. And we might say, wait, when did I receive you? And Jesus says, when you reached out and received one of the least of these, one of those human beings in your life who you knew as you gave that there was no reasonable expectation that they would give you anything back. They were incapable of it. But you gave out of the pure grace that comes by virtue of your connection to me. That was receiving the Lord Jesus Christ, King of the universe. And God noticed it. And he remembered it on that day. All right, quickly. I'm 1 minute over time, so quickly. Sunday school lesson. The highest calling of any citizen of God's kingdom is modeled in Christ, who did not come to be served, but to serve. That is our highest calling. Our highest calling is to serve and not to be served. The highest recipient of our service is never the prestige people who may not need it so much, but it's those who fall into that class of folks that we call the least of these. The highest reward of receiving one who is least is the promise that in doing so, we've received Christ himself. I hope that's faithful to the sense of that text. But I'm going to tell you this, the next several stories that Mark gives us are a constant and relentless unpackaging of something of what we've seen right here.